The first thing my mother did at that Thanksgiving table was smile. Not the warm kind, not the kind that reaches your eyes. It was the thin, practiced smile she reserved for moments when she was about to say something cruel, but wanted witnesses to remember her as gracious. I was 29 years old, sitting in my parents' dining room in a colonial house outside Hartford, Connecticut, surrounded by china plates, crystal glasses, and relatives who pretended not to notice how quiet I had become. The turkey steamed at the center of the table. The scent of sage and butter hung heavy in the air. Candles flickered, reflecting off the silverware, turning the room golden and false. I remember thinking just for a second that maybe this year would be different. That thought still embarrasses me. My mother cleared her throat. "Before we eat," she said, folding her hands, "your father and I have an announcement." Across from me, my younger sister Rebecca straightened immediately. She was already smiling, already expecting applause. She always knew when something was meant for her. My father lifted his glass. "We've finalized the revisions to our will." The word landed like a stone in my chest. Will, inheritance, family business, words that had hovered around my childhood like locked doors I was never meant to open. My aunt murmured something approving. My grandmother dabbed her lips with a napkin. My cousins leaned in, hungry for drama masked as tradition. And my father continued, his voice calm, rehearsed. "We've decided it's time to make things clear, transparent, no more confusion." Rebecca reached for her husband's hand beneath the table. He squeezed back, confident, comfortable, already belonging. My mother turned her head slightly, just enough to look at me without fully facing me. "Rebecca will inherit the house, the company shares, the trust." The room hummed with approval. Someone said, "That makes sense." Someone else nodded like this had been obvious all along. I waited. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me still believed in fairness, or love, or the idea that being the older daughter meant something. My father didn't look at me when he spoke again. As for Eleanor, he said, using my full name, the way he did when he wanted distance, "We believe it's best she continue on her own path." That was it. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that I existed at the table where my life had just been divided. My mother finally met my eyes. Her smile never wavered. "You've always been independent," she said softly. "This feels appropriate." Appropriate. I felt the heat rise in my face, but my body went cold. Around me, forks clinked. Wine was poured. The turkey was carved. Life moved forward as if something fundamental hadn't just been taken from me. Rebecca leaned across the table, voice sweet. "You're so creative, Ellie. You'll be fine. You don't need any of this." Her words sounded generous. They were not. I pressed my napkin into my lap to keep my hands from shaking. For years I had been the daughter who didn't fit, the one who didn't want to join the family real estate firm, the one who chose a career in community planning instead of corporate development, the one who asked uncomfortable questions about ethics, displacement, and money. I had thought that difference made me invisible. I was wrong. It made me expendable. My grandmother finally spoke. "Family is about harmony," she said, her voice thin with age and authority. "And Eleanor has always disrupted that." My father nodded once as if the verdict had been confirmed. Something cracked inside me then. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet, irreversible shift. I looked around the table, at my parents, at my sister, at the relatives who had watched me grow up and now watched me disappear. No one stopped them. No one said my name. I stood up. The scrape of my chair against the hardwood floor cut through the room. Conversations faltered. My mother's smile flickered just slightly. "I understand," I said. My voice sounded calm even to me. That scared me more than anger would have. My father finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, irritated. "Sit down, Eleanor. Don't make this into something it isn't." "Oh, it already is," I replied. Rebecca's eyes widened. Her husband looked down at his plate. "I just want to be clear," I continued. "I'm excluded, officially, from the will, from the business, from this family's future." My mother sighed, as if burdened by my tone rather than her decision. "You're being dramatic." I nodded slowly. "Then let me be dramatic one last time." I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. "You don't get to erase me quietly," I said. "If you're cutting me out, do it knowing I see exactly who you are." Silence flooded the room. My father's jaw tightened. "You always do this," he snapped. "You turn every gathering into a confrontation." I looked at him. Really looked at him. The man who had taught me to ride a bike. The man who had stopped coming to my art shows. The man who had just told me I wasn't worth planning for. No, I said. You've been doing this my entire life. I'm just finally naming it. I walked toward the door. Behind me, my grandmother whispered something about ungrateful children. My mother said my name once, sharp and warning. Rebecca said nothing. Outside, the air was cold and clean. Leaves skittered across the driveway. My breath came out in short clouds. I stood there for a moment staring at the house I had grown up in, the windows glowing warmly behind me. That was the moment I understood something I had been too afraid to admit before. They hadn't just excluded me from their will. They had excluded me from their loyalty, their protection, their love. And if they believed that cutting me out would make their lives easier, quieter, more successful, then they had made one terrible miscalculation. Because I was done asking to belong. And I was about to make sure they remembered exactly who they had tried to erase. I didn't know how yet. I only knew this. What they had taken from me that night, I would take back in a way they never saw coming. And this time they would be watching. I didn't go home after Thanksgiving. That felt important, though. I didn't know why at the time. I drove past my apartment, past the exit I took every day, and kept going until the highway thinned and the houses grew smaller. I pulled into a 24-hour diner off the interstate, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted burned no matter how fresh it was. I sat there for hours staring at the condensation sliding down my mug, replaying the scene at my parents' table until every word felt etched into my bones. You've always been independent. Family is about harmony. You disrupt it. Independent, disruptive, inappropriate. Those were the words they had used to explain why I was disposable. By the time I finally checked my phone, it was close to midnight. Notifications stacked on the screen like accusations, missed calls from my mother, a message from Rebecca that simply said you didn't have to make a scene. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened an email that had come in earlier that evening, buried beneath the family chaos. The subject line was plain. Regarding the Hartford redevelopment project, I almost ignored it. My job as a municipal planning consultant had been hanging by a thread for months. Budget freezes, political interference, developers with deeper pockets than ethics. I had learned not to expect good news, but something made me open it. The message was short. Eleanor, we've decided to move forward with a different consultant. This decision comes from above. Thank you for your time. No signature, no explanation. I stared at the words until they blurred. From above. That phrase echoed uncomfortably with my father's voice at the table. We've decided. I laughed quietly, a hollow sound that startled the waitress when she came to refill my cup. Everything okay, honey? She asked. I nodded. Just one of those nights. She smiled sympathetically, the way strangers do when they sense pain, but don't ask for details. By the time I finally drove back to my apartment, the sky was lightening at the edges. My phone buzzed again as I unlocked the door. This time it was a voicemail from my supervisor. Eleanor, he said, his voice strained. I wanted you to hear this from me. There's pressure coming down from certain parties. We're being forced to cut ties. I'm sorry. Certain parties? I sank onto the edge of my bed, my coat still on my shoes, still on my keys, digging into my palm. My father sat on the board of 3 local development trusts. Rebecca's husband worked for one of the largest private equity firms funding urban redevelopment in the region. And I had just publicly challenged them. I closed my eyes. This wasn't coincidence. The realization didn't come with rage at first. It came with a slow, suffocating clarity. The kind that makes you see your entire life rearranged into a pattern you were never meant to notice. The forgotten birthdays. The promotion recommendations that never went through. The projects reassigned at the last minute. I had always assumed I simply wasn't good enough yet. I was wrong. They hadn't ignored me. They had managed me. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating nonstop. Texts from colleagues, a message from an old professor, even one from a woman I barely remembered working with years ago. Have you seen the news? I sat up, heart pounding. The headline stared back at me from every local outlet. Hartford redevelopment deal fast-tracked amid allegations of insider influence. I opened the article, my fingers trembling. The project I had been consulting on, the one I'd been removed from overnight, had been awarded to a private firm with close ties to the Whitmore Group, my brother-in-law's firm. The quotes were glowing, the language confident, the timeline suspiciously accelerated. And then I saw the name buried halfway down the page. Board Advisor Charles Whitmore. My father. I dropped the phone. For a moment I couldn't breathe. They hadn't just cut me out of the family. They had cut me out of my career. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Rebecca. I answered before I could stop myself. "You should be careful," she said immediately, her voice low and urgent. "People are talking." "About what?" I asked. She hesitated. "About you. About how emotional you were at Thanksgiving. About how unstable you've been lately." I closed my eyes. "They're saying," she continued, "that's why you were let go. Not because of Dad, not because of Daniel." Daniel. She always used his name when it mattered. "They're protecting you," she added, as if that softened the blow. "By destroying my reputation," I asked. There was a pause. "You didn't have to challenge them like that," she said finally. "You could have kept things cordial." I thought of the smile on my mother's face as she erased me. "I lost my job, Rebecca." "I know," she said, and for a split second something like guilt flickered through her voice. "But this doesn't have to get worse." That was when it clicked. This wasn't damage control. This was a warning. They were telling me to stay quiet, to disappear gracefully, to let them rewrite the story while I watched. I felt something shift inside me again, sharper this time. "No," I said softly. "What?" she asked. "No," I repeated. "This doesn't stop here." Her breath caught. "Ellie, don't do this." "I didn't start this," I said. "But I'm done pretending I'm powerless." I hung up before she could respond. That afternoon, I pulled every file I had ever saved. Emails, meeting notes, draft proposals, calendars. Every project I'd been involved in that had mysteriously gone sideways. Every name that kept appearing in the background. Patterns emerged quickly. Too quickly. My father's influence was everywhere. Not just in what I lost, but in what he gained. And as the sun set outside my apartment window, casting long shadows across the floor, one truth settled heavily into my chest. They thought cutting me out would silence me. They thought I would retreat. What they didn't understand yet was this: they had given me nothing left to lose. And I was finally free to tell the truth. By the third morning after Thanksgiving, sleep became optional. I lay awake on my couch laptop balanced on my knees, the blue light burning into my eyes as the city outside my window sank into silence. I had stopped checking messages from my family. I let them pile up unanswered small red numbers screaming from my phone like alarms I refused to hear. Instead, I built timelines. That's what planners do. We map cause and effect. We track who benefits, who loses, and who pretends not to notice the difference. And the more I mapped, the uglier it became. The Hartford redevelopment deal wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a pattern stretching back nearly a decade. Zoning changes approved just before private acquisitions. Community input sessions quietly canceled. Consultants like me brought in to create the illusion of transparency, then removed once our work was done. My father's name appeared everywhere, sometimes directly, sometimes through shell boards and advisory committees, sometimes through people he mentored, promoted, protected. I felt sick, not just because of the corruption, but because I had helped legitimize it. Every report I had written in good faith, every meeting where I argued for ethical oversight while unknowingly surrounded by people who had already decided the outcome. Every time I went home thinking I hadn't tried hard enough, I closed my laptop and pressed my palms into my eyes. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was reckoning. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text followed. "This is Martin Hale. We should talk." The name made my stomach flip. Martin Hale was a senior investigative reporter at the Boston Ledger. He specialized in white-collar corruption. I had read his work for years, admired how he dismantled powerful men without raising his voice. I typed back before I could overthink it. "About what?" The reply came almost instantly. "Your father, and why you were removed from Hartford." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Someone else saw it. We met the next day at a quiet cafe near the river. Martin was older than I expected, gray at the temples, eyes sharp but kind. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You were never supposed to be on that project," he said after we ordered. I frowned. "Then why bring me in?" "To make it look clean," he replied. "You have a reputation for integrity. That matters." My laugh was bitter, apparently not enough. "It mattered until it didn't," he said calmly, "until your last report raised concerns." I remembered the memo I'd sent 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. A warning about irregular land valuations, a request for further review. I had been proud of that memo. Now I understood why it cost me everything. "They're scared," Martin continued, "and they should be." He slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were documents I had never seen before. Internal emails, financial projections, a web of relationships laid bare in black and white. My father's signature appeared more than once. I can't publish this without someone on the inside, Martin said. Someone willing to speak. My hands trembled as I closed the folder. Me, I said. He studied me carefully. This will get ugly. I know. They'll come after your credibility. They already have. They'll paint you as emotional, vindictive. I thought of Rebecca's voice, emotional, unstable. Let them, I said. Martin nodded slowly. Then we start carefully. Carefully. That word would come to define the next 6 weeks of my life. We met in different locations every time. I fed him information piece by piece, names, dates, connections. I reached out to former colleagues who had been quietly pushed aside like I had. Some ignored me. Some were afraid. But a few said yes. One woman cried on the phone when I told her she wasn't alone. I thought I was crazy, she said. I thought I'd imagined it. You hadn't, I told her. Neither had I. As the investigation grew, so did the pressure. My mother showed up at my apartment unannounced one afternoon. She stood in my doorway like she owned the space. You're embarrassing us, she said without greeting. You embarrassed yourselves, I replied. Her eyes flicked to my laptop to the folders scattered across the table. What are you doing? Working, I said. She laughed sharply. On what, ruining your father? I'm telling the truth. Her face hardened. Truth is subjective. I stood. Corruption isn't. Her hand slapped the counter. Do you have any idea what you're risking? Yes, I said quietly, and I'm willing to risk it. She stared at me like she didn't recognize me. Rebecca is worried, she said finally. Your grandmother is sick over this. They were sick over me existing, I replied. They'll survive. She left without another word. The article broke on a Tuesday morning. I woke up to my phone exploding with notifications. Headlines filled the screen. Local development empire under scrutiny for ethical violations. Board advisor Charles Whitmore named in conflict of interest probe. I sat on my couch, heart racing, as I read my father's name in print alongside words like influence manipulation investigation. By noon it had gone national. By evening his phone was disconnected. Rebecca called me sobbing. How could you do this? She cried. I closed my eyes. How could he? Silence crackled between us. This will destroy him, she whispered. He destroyed himself, I said. The next day, the board announced an internal review. The next week, my father resigned. And in the quiet that followed, as the city outside my window pulsed with life, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't angry in the way I thought I would be. I felt clear. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to them. I was acting for myself. And the story wasn't over. Not even close. The fallout didn't arrive like a storm. It came like fog, quiet, creeping, and impossible to escape once it settled in. The week after my father resigned, the house outside Hartford went dark. No porch lights, no holiday decorations, no cars in the driveway. My mother stopped answering calls. Rebecca deleted her social media accounts overnight. The family that had once moved as a single confident unit now scattered in silence. Publicly, they called it privacy. Privately, it was panic. I learned that word well in the days that followed. Panic sounds like a voicemail left too late at night, voice shaking but still trying to sound dignified. Panic looks like a former colleague whispering my name in a cafe and sliding into the seat across from me as if we were conspirators. Panic feels like your phone vibrating in your pocket and knowing before you look that someone wants something from you. For the first time in my life, they needed me, and that changed everything. I received an email from a woman named Claire Monroe 3 days after the article went national. She was the chief operating officer of Whitmore Development, my father's company. The company that had been my inheritance in another life. Her message was formal. Eleanor. Given recent events, the board would like to speak with you regarding your experience and insight. We believe your perspective could be valuable during this transitional period. Transitional? I laughed when I read it, out loud, alone in my apartment. They were bleeding. Contracts were frozen. Lenders were nervous. City councils were suddenly interested in transparency. The empire my father had built on quiet influence was unraveling faster than anyone expected, and they thought I would help them clean it up. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I met Martin again. They're reaching out, I told him. He nodded. They will. What do I do? That depends, he said. What do you want? The question stopped me cold. For so long, my life had been about reacting to my family, proving something, surviving something, escaping something. What did I want? I thought of Thanksgiving night, the will, the way my mother's smile hadn't cracked even as she erased me. I want control, I said slowly. Not over them, over myself. Martin smiled faintly. Then don't rush. So I didn't. I let the emails sit. I let the board stew. I let the headlines keep circulating. Each day brought a new development. Another client pulled out. Another city announced an audit. Another name tied to my father quietly stepped down. The world was doing my work for me. Then my grandmother called. Her voice was weak, brittle with age and illness. "Eleanor," she said, "you've made your point." I closed my eyes. I didn't make anything. I told the truth. "You always had to be right," she murmured. "And you always had to be comfortable," I replied. She sighed. "Your father is unwell." That was the first time anyone said it out loud. I felt a flicker of something then. Not guilt, not pity. Recognition. This was the card they would play. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "You could help him," she pressed. "You could stop this." I looked around my apartment, at the stacks of documents, at the notes I'd taken, at the version of myself who had finally stopped shrinking. "I already did help," I said, "by ending it." She hung up on me. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The next morning, I replied to Claire Monroe, "I'm willing to listen." The meeting took place in a glass conference room overlooking the river. The same building I'd walked past for years without being allowed inside. The same logo gleamed on the wall. Whitmore Development. Bold, confident, cracked now if you knew where to look. Claire greeted me with a tight smile. Two board members sat at the table, men who had once nodded politely at family dinners and then ignored me completely. "We appreciate you coming," Claire began. "I didn't come for appreciation," I said calmly. "I came for clarity." She stiffened, of course. They launched into rehearsed language, reputation management, strategic restructuring, independent oversight, words that meant nothing without action. Finally, one of the men leaned forward. "We believe your involvement could signal accountability." I met his gaze. "You want my name?" "Yes," he admitted. "Your credibility." "My credibility. The thing my family had tried to destroy." "What are you offering?" I asked. Claire slid a folder toward me. Inside was a consulting proposal, generous compensation, advisory authority, a seat at the table. But not ownership, not power, not truth. I closed the folder. "No," I said. The air in the room shifted. "This isn't negotiation," the man said, irritation creeping in. "This is an olive branch." "This is damage control," I replied, "and I'm not interested." Claire's voice tightened. "What would you want then?" I thought of the will, the way my future had been decided without me. "I want transparency," I said. "Full access, public accountability. And I want it in writing that my role is not symbolic." They exchanged glances. "That's not realistic," one of them said. I stood. "Then neither is my participation." I walked out without shaking hands. By the time I reached the elevator, my phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca. "We need to talk, please." I stared at the doors closing in front of me, my reflection staring back. Calm, centered, unmoved. I typed back, "Only if it's honest." Her reply came seconds later. "Then you should come to the house." The house, the place where it had all started. I didn't answer right away, but I knew I would go. Not because they asked, but because I was ready, and because whatever waited for me there was going to change the game entirely. The house looked smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing that struck me as I pulled into the driveway just before dusk. The colonial facade, once imposing, now felt tired. The paint along the shutters was peeling. The hedges were overgrown. One porch light flickered weakly, like it hadn't decided whether it was worth staying on. I sat in my car for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. I had spent years imagining what it would feel like to come back here with power, with answers, with leverage. I had expected triumph to feel loud. Instead, it felt quiet, heavy, focused. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me immediately. Lemon cleaner layered over something stale. An attempt to erase the past without addressing what had caused it. Rebecca met me in the foyer. She looked thinner, older. The confidence she wore so easily at Thanksgiving had cracked around the edges. "You came," she said. "I said I would," I replied. She nodded and gestured toward the living room. "He's in there." She didn't say dad or father, just he. That told me everything. The living room lights were dim. My father sat in his armchair, wrapped in a sweater I didn't recognize. His hair was more gray than silver now, his posture slumped in a way I had never seen before. For a moment, a sharp, unwanted memory surfaced of him teaching me to skip stones at the lake when I was 8, his laughter easy, unguarded. I pushed it away. "Eleanor," he said when he saw me. "Not Ellie, not sweetheart, Eleanor, formal, defensive." "You wanted to talk," I said, remaining standing. He gestured weakly to the couch. "Sit." "I'd rather not." Rebecca hovered near the doorway, arms crossed tightly over her chest. My father cleared his throat. "Things have escalated. That tends to happen when the truth comes out, I replied. His jaw tightened, but he didn't snap back the way he used to. That alone told me how far things had fallen. The board is panicking, he admitted. They're considering measures that could permanently damage the company. I tilted my head. You mean measures that would finally hold people accountable? He flinched. You've made your point, he said. This doesn't need to go any further. There it was. The same line my grandmother had used. The same belief that consequences had an expiration date. I didn't make a point, I said evenly. I exposed a system. Rebecca stepped forward. Ellie, please. This is tearing the family apart. I looked at her then, really looked, at the way her eyes darted between me and him, at the way her hands trembled slightly. You mean it's tearing apart the version of the family that worked for you, I said. Her mouth opened, then closed. My father leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What do you want? He asked, his voice low. The question landed differently this time. Not dismissive, not rhetorical. Desperate. I want you to tell the truth, I said. Publicly, fully. His head snapped up. Absolutely not. I want you to acknowledge what you did. I continued. The manipulation, the conflicts of interest, the way you used your influence to punish dissent. Rebecca shook her head. That would ruin everything. No, I said, it would end the lie. My father pushed himself up from the chair, standing with effort. You don't understand what you're asking. I understand exactly, I replied. You built your career by staying just inside the line. You taught me that rules were flexible for people who knew how to bend them. And when I refused to bend, you removed me. That's not true, he snapped, then faltered. That's not how it happened. It is, I said. I have the emails, the timelines, the testimony. Silence stretched between us. Rebecca's voice cracked. You'd destroy him. I met her gaze. He destroyed me first. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My father sank back into his chair, suddenly looking very old. If I do this, he said quietly, there's no coming back. There was no coming back the night you wrote me out of the will, I replied. You just didn't think I'd notice. He closed his eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel, counting down something none of us could stop. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked at me. If I go public, he said, will you stop? The question was small, vulnerable, human, and it was the wrong one. This isn't about stopping, I said. It's about finishing. Rebecca let out a quiet sob. My father nodded slowly as if absorbing a blow. Then you leave me no choice. I'm not the one with the choice, I replied. You are. I turned toward the door. Eleanor, he said, his voice breaking for the first time. I paused but didn't turn around. I never meant to hurt you, he said. I closed my eyes. That doesn't matter, I said softly. Only what you did. I walked out before he could say anything else. As I drove away, my phone buzzed. A text from Martin. He's preparing a statement. Sources confirm. This is moving fast. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline caught up with me. This was it. The moment where power shifted completely. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was setting the terms, and no matter what happened next, one thing was certain. They would never control the narrative again. The statement went live at 9 in the morning. I didn't watch it immediately. I made coffee instead, the cheap kind I'd started buying after losing my job, and stood by the window while steam fogged the glass. Snow had started falling overnight, softening the edges of the city. It felt strange that the world could look so calm on a day that would dismantle a man who had once seemed untouchable. My phone buzzed nonstop on the counter. Martin texted first. It's out. Full admission. No denials. Then messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Journalists. Former colleagues. People who had once avoided my eye, now eager to hear my voice. I waited until the coffee went cold before pressing play. My father sat at a table in front of a neutral backdrop. No logo. No family photos. He looked smaller than he ever had, his shoulders rounded, his hands folded as if he were bracing himself. He spoke carefully, slowly, as if each word carried weight. He admitted to conflicts of interest, to leveraging advisory positions for personal gain, to influencing decisions that should have been independent. He stopped just short of using the word corruption, but the meaning was unmistakable. Then came the part that made my breath catch. I failed my daughter, he said. I punished her for refusing to compromise her ethics. That was wrong. I turned the video off. I didn't need to hear the rest. The apology was public, strategic, necessary. It was also too late. By noon, the fallout was immediate. The board announced his permanent removal. 2 city councils suspended projects tied to his firm. An independent investigation was launched. Investors fled. The company stock dropped sharply, numbers bleeding red across financial screens. Rebecca called me 3 times. I didn't answer. Instead, I met Martin at his office. The newsroom buzzed with energy I could feel in my bones. Screens flashed headlines. Phones rang without pause. Reporters leaned over desks, voices urgent and sharp. He looked up when I entered. "You okay?" I considered the question. "I'm steady," I said. He nodded. "Good, because this isn't over." He slid a document toward me. "There's interest in you." "Interest," I repeated. "From the State Ethics Commission," he said. "And from a nonprofit oversight group. They want you involved, advisory roles, public testimony." I felt a strange mix of vindication and dread. "For years they shut me out," I said. "Now they want me everywhere." "That's how it works," Martin replied. "Truth makes people uncomfortable, then indispensable." That afternoon, I testified before a preliminary review panel. The room was sterile fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. I spoke calmly, clearly, laying out facts without embellishment. Dates, names, processes, no emotion. I refused to give them the satisfaction of calling me bitter. When it was over, a woman on the panel leaned forward. "You could have stayed quiet," she said. "Why didn't you?" I thought of Thanksgiving, the will, my mother's smile. "Because silence was the system," I said. She nodded slowly. By evening, my inbox flooded with opportunities. Consulting offers, speaking requests, invitations to join boards focused on transparency and ethical development. The irony wasn't lost on me. The career my family had quietly strangled was now resurrecting itself in public, undeniable ways. That night, Rebecca finally came to my apartment. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red. She held herself like someone who had been holding her breath for weeks. "I don't recognize him anymore," she said after I let her in. "I poured us both water. I never did." She flinched. "That's not fair." I met her gaze. "It's honest." She sank onto the couch. "Everything is falling apart." "No," I said. "Everything is being revealed." She shook her head. "You don't understand what this is doing to Mom, to Grandma." I sat across from her. Did they understand what it did to me? Her silence answered for her. I lost my job. I continued. My reputation. My place in this family. And none of you asked if I was okay. Tears slid down her cheeks. "I didn't think it would go this far." "I did," I said. "That's why I spoke." She looked up, anger flashing through the grief. "So what now?" "You win." I considered that. "No," I said slowly. "I change." She frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I stop centering my life around your approval," I said. "It means I build something that doesn't rely on their permission." She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "Come with me," she said suddenly. "We can fix this together." I shook my head. "I'm not fixing a system that needs to end." She left soon after, her footsteps heavy down the hallway. That night, alone again, I opened a new document on my laptop. Not evidence, not timelines, a proposal. A firm focused on ethical urban development, transparent processes, community-led planning, accountability built into every contract, the kind of work I had always wanted to do. I titled it simply, Clear Ground. As snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the city in quiet resolve, I realized something profound. Revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't cruelty. It was building a life so aligned with truth that the lie could no longer survive beside it. And I was just getting started. Clear Ground didn't begin with confidence. It began with fear. The kind that wakes you at 3 in the morning with your heart racing and your mouth dry. The kind that whispers, "Who do you think you are?" louder than any critic ever could. I sat at my kitchen table night after night, legal pads spread out, coffee reheated too many times, wondering if I was about to make the same mistake my parents always accused me of making. Wanting too much. The difference was this time I wanted it for myself. I filed the paperwork quietly. No announcement, no press. Just forms, fees, and a bank account that looked dangerously small once the startup costs cleared. My savings were thin, my safety net non-existent. If this failed, there would be no family to fall back on. That used to terrify me. Now it clarified everything. The first rejection came quickly, then another. Municipal boards that praised my courage but passed on my proposal. Developers who said the word ethics like it was a liability. Old contacts who suddenly took days to respond, then weeks, then never. I kept going. I learned how to pitch without flinching. How to sit across from men who reminded me of my father and not shrink. How to explain transparency in language that made profit-driven people lean forward instead of roll their eyes. Still, the nights were hard. One evening, as snow melted into gray slush along the sidewalks, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. I was told you're the one who doesn't play games, a woman said when I answered. Her name was Lila Moreno. She chaired a neighborhood council in a riverfront district that had been stalled in development for years. Big promises, no follow-through. Residents pushed out before protections were in place. They keep sending men in suits who talk about revitalization, she said. But none of them live here. I do, I replied. In this city. She paused. Can you come to a meeting tomorrow? I showed up with no slide deck, no polished pitch, just notes and questions. The room was packed. Folding chairs, mismatched tables, people with tired eyes and crossed arms, suspicion thick in the air. I recognized the look. I had worn it myself. I'm not here to sell you anything, I said. I'm here to listen. They tested me, hard. They asked about displacement, about rent caps, about accountability, about who would benefit when the riverfront finally gleamed the way developers promised. I answered honestly when I could, and when I couldn't, I said so. 2 hours later, Lila pulled me aside. No one's ever done that before, she said. Done what? Admitted limits. Clear Ground got its first contract that night. Small, modest pay, enormous responsibility. I walked home in the cold, my breath fogging the air, smiling like someone who had just stepped onto solid ground after years of drifting. The press noticed within weeks, not because of money, because of contrast. Articles began to circulate about community-first planning, about a woman who had exposed corruption and then refused to profit from the same systems. My name appeared again, this time without scandal attached. My mother left a voicemail I didn't return. My grandmother sent a card that said nothing but be careful. Rebecca sent nothing at all. The riverfront project moved slowly. On purpose, community forums replaced closed-door meetings. Budgets were published online, every decision documented. Developers grumbled, some walked away. The ones who stayed learned quickly that I wasn't bluffing. One afternoon, a man leaned across a conference table and said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I met his gaze. "You're right, accountability is inconvenient." He didn't smile. By spring, Clear Ground had 3 projects. Then 5. My calendar filled, my bank account stabilized. My name became shorthand for something I'd never been called before. Trustworthy. That was when the counterattack began. An op-ed appeared questioning my motives. A former colleague suggested I was using ethics as branding. An anonymous source claimed I was difficult to work with. I laughed when I read it. Difficult. The same word my mother used whenever I refused to behave. I didn't respond publicly. I responded with results. Then came the subpoena. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under my door like a threat disguised as paperwork. A request for testimony. My name tied again to my father's investigation. I sat on the floor reading it, heart pounding. Even now they could pull me back in. Even now his shadow reached for me. Martin called within the hour. They want to know everything he said. Are you ready? I thought of the girl at Thanksgiving standing with her coat in her hands, realizing she had been written out of her own life. Yes, I said. Testifying this time felt different. I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't exposing out of desperation. I was speaking as someone who had already chosen a different path. When it was over, a woman from the commission pulled me aside. "We need people like you," she said. "I'm already busy," I replied, half smiling. She smiled back, I figured. That night, alone in my apartment, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. The city hummed below, alive and indifferent. For the first time, that indifference felt like freedom. I checked my phone and saw a missed call from Rebecca. I didn't return it. Instead, I opened my laptop and reviewed a new proposal. A multi-city initiative. Real funding. Real oversight. A chance to scale everything I believed in. As I read, a quiet certainty settled over me. They had tried to erase me by cutting me out. What they hadn't anticipated was this. Being excluded had taught me how to build something they could never own. And the further I moved forward, the clearer it became. My revenge wasn't about watching them fall. It was about never needing them to rise again. The invitation came in an envelope thick enough to feel deliberate. Cream-colored paper. Embossed lettering. My full name printed in a font my mother would have approved of. I recognized the stationery immediately, even before I read the return address. Whitmore House. I let it sit on my kitchen counter for an entire day. Clear Ground was in the middle of its largest proposal, yet a regional initiative that would tie 3 cities together under a shared transparency charter. My calendar was packed. My phone rang constantly. I had no reason to look backward, and yet the envelope stayed where I could see it. I opened it after midnight. Eleanor. Your grandmother's health has declined. She has asked to see you. Dinner this Sunday. Your presence would mean a great deal. No signature. I closed my eyes. This was the new approach. Not anger, not control, vulnerability. It would have worked once. Sunday evening found me driving up the familiar road again, headlights cutting through early dusk. The house looked brighter than the last time I'd seen it. Lights on in every window, cars lining the street. The family gathering had been resurrected with intention. Inside voices rose and fell. Laughter, glasses clinking, the smell of roast meat and sugar, comfort weaponized as invitation. My grandmother sat in her usual chair wrapped in a shawl. Age had shrunk her, softened her edges. When she saw me, her eyes filled. "You came," she said. "I said I would," I replied gently. My mother hovered nearby, watching closely. Rebecca stood by the fireplace, her posture tense. Dinner passed with forced normalcy, small talk, safe topics. No one mentioned the investigation, or the board, or the company's collapse and restructuring. Until dessert. My father cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology," he said, looking directly at me. The room froze. My mother stiffened. Rebecca's eyes widened. "I treated you unfairly," he continued. "I confused obedience with loyalty. And I punished you for having a conscience." It was the most I had ever heard him admit. "I'm asking," he said carefully, "if you would consider coming back, not as a daughter, as a partner." The word hung in the air. Partner. My mother smiled tightly. Rebecca watched me with something like hope. I set my fork down. "No," I said. The silence that followed was deafening. My father blinked. "You didn't hear me." "I heard you," I replied, "and I appreciate the apology." My mother leaned forward. "Eleanor, this is what you wanted." "No," I said calmly. "This is what you think I wanted." My grandmother's voice trembled. "Family should stay together. Family shouldn't require erasure," I said softly. My father's face hardened. "You'd let everything fall apart out of spite." "This isn't spite," I replied. "It's boundaries." Rebecca finally spoke. "So that's it. You walk away." I met her gaze. "I walked away months ago. I just stopped pretending it was temporary." I stood lifting my coat from the back of the chair. "I don't want your company," I said. "And I don't want your approval. I want you to understand that I built something without you, and I won't trade it to make you comfortable." My father's voice dropped. "You'll regret this." I paused at the doorway. "I already know what regret feels like," I said. "It doesn't live here anymore." Outside, the night air was crisp, clean. I breathed deeply as I walked to my car. By the time I reached home, my phone buzzed with a notification. "Clear ground proposal approved." I smiled. They had offered me reconciliation wrapped in control. I chose myself, and in doing so, I closed the last door they could use to pull me back. The next chapter of my life was no longer a reaction. It was a direction. Success changes the temperature of a room. I noticed it first in meetings. People leaned in instead of talking over me. They asked questions and waited for answers. They followed up. They remembered details. Respect didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with silence, the kind that means people are actually listening. Clear ground was no longer a risk, it was a reference. The regional initiative moved from proposal to pilot in less than 3 months. 3 cities signed on reluctantly at first, then with growing confidence as community councils publicly endorsed the framework. Transparency charters were posted online. Budgets were open to scrutiny. Developers who once relied on private relationships now had to explain themselves in daylight. Some walked away, others adapted. That distinction mattered. I hired, slowly, carefully, people with scars, former city employees pushed out for asking questions, analysts who had watched data get buried, designers who believed space shaped dignity, not just profit. We worked long hours, but there was no shouting, no ego theatrics, no closed doors where decisions disappeared. That culture didn't come from management books. It came from memory. One afternoon, as spring light poured through the office windows, my assistant knocked lightly and said, "There's a woman here to see you. She says it's personal." Rebecca stepped in. She looked different, less polished, more real. Her coat was wrinkled, her eyes were tired. "I won't stay long," she said. I gestured to the chair. "Sit." She hesitated, then did. "They're selling the house," she said quietly. I nodded. I had expected that. "Dad's health isn't good," she continued. "The board forced him out completely. Mom's furious at everyone. Grandma barely speaks." I waited. "They blame you," she said, "and they don't." I raised an eyebrow. "They blame you for the exposure," she clarified. "They blame themselves for the consequences." I leaned back in my chair. "And you?" She swallowed. I don't know who I am without them. That honesty surprised me. I spent my whole life being the good daughter, she said. The one who fit, the one who didn't rock the boat. And now the boat is gone. I studied her. The sister who had once smiled while I disappeared. The sister who had benefited from my silence. What do you want from me? I asked. She looked up, eyes wet. I want to know how you did it, how you walked away. I considered the question. I didn't walk away all at once, I said. I walked away in pieces, every time I told the truth instead of staying quiet. She nodded slowly. I'm not asking for a job, she said quickly. I know better. I wouldn't offer one, I replied gently. She flinched, then exhaled. Fair. We sat in silence for a moment. I don't hate you, she said finally. I hated that you reminded me something was wrong. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, a community meeting was gathering in the plaza below. Folding chairs, clipboards, conversations layered with anticipation. I don't need apologies, I said. I need distance. She nodded. I understand. When she left, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just closure. The next test came sooner than expected. A national developer announced a major waterfront project in one of our pilot cities. Big money, big promises, political pressure immediate and intense. Clearground was asked to review the plan. The proposal was slick, glossy renderings, carefully worded commitments, and buried in the appendices a familiar pattern. Deferred protections, vague timelines, accountability pushed just far enough into the future to become meaningless. The mayor called me personally. This is good for the city, he said. We need this. I took a breath. Then it can survive scrutiny. The developer requested a private meeting. I declined. They went to the press. An article appeared questioning whether Clearground was obstructing progress, whether my personal history made me biased against large developers. The word vendetta appeared more than once. I smiled when I read it. They were using the same playbook. I scheduled a public forum instead. The hall filled quickly. Residents, reporters, city officials. The developers team sat stiffly in the front row. I walked to the podium without notes. This isn't about stopping development, I said. It's about deciding who development is for. I walked them through the proposal, line by line. I showed what was promised and what was postponed, what was guaranteed and what was implied. I didn't accuse, I revealed. By the end, the room buzzed with questions the developers couldn't easily answer. 2 weeks later, they returned with revisions, stronger protections, real timelines, binding agreements. The project moved forward. Ethically, that night as I locked the office, I realized something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer reacting to injustice. I was setting standards. My phone buzzed as I walked to my car. A message from Martin. They're calling you a model now. Other cities want in. I smiled to myself. At home, I poured a glass of wine and sat at my desk. The city lights blinked outside, steady and unassuming. I opened a blank document and began outlining the next phase. Expansion. Training. Succession. Making sure Clearground would outlast me. Because this was never about winning against my family. It was about building something that couldn't be undone by their approval or their rejection. As I saved the file, one last thought settled in. They had tried to control me through inheritance, through silence, through fear. Instead, they had taught me exactly how power worked, and I had chosen to use it differently. The tables hadn't just turned. I had built a new room entirely, one they could never enter. The cease and desist letter arrived on a Thursday. It was thick, formal, and written in the kind of language meant to intimidate rather than persuade. I recognized the law firm immediately. Old money. Old loyalty. The same firm that had handled my parents' estate planning for decades. The same firm that had quietly removed my name from the will with surgical precision. I read the letter twice, then a third time. They were accusing Clearground of reputational harm, of misrepresentation, of deliberately interfering with private business interests. They demanded I retract statements, limit public commentary, and cease involvement in matters related to Whitmore Development and its affiliates. In other words, they wanted me silent again. I leaned back in my chair and laughed. Not loudly, not bitterly, just a single tired breath of amusement. They were late. By the time the letter arrived, Clearground had already been invited to advise on a statewide transparency framework. My calendar was booked months out. My work was public documented and independently verified. Every accusation in the letter dissolved under the weight of facts. Still, they were trying, and that meant something else was happening behind the scenes. I called my attorney, Mara Feldman, a woman with sharp eyes and zero patience for bluster. She read the letter and shook her head. This isn't about winning, she said. It's about reminding you where power used to live. Used to, I agreed. She tapped the paper. Do you want to respond? Yes, I said, but not the way they expect. We drafted a reply that was brief, factual, and devastatingly calm. No denials, no emotion, just references, public records, citations, an invitation to pursue the matter in court if they wished. They didn't. Instead, the next move came from my mother. She called late that night, her voice clipped and controlled. You've humiliated us enough. I didn't write the letter, I replied. You encouraged this, she snapped. You keep dragging the past into the spotlight. The past is why the spotlight exists, I said. There was a pause. Then her voice dropped sharp and precise. If you don't step back, there will be consequences. I closed my eyes. There it was again. The language of my childhood. Behave or else. I already paid for those consequences, I said quietly. They don't scare me anymore. She hung up without another word. The next morning, I received an email from a probate attorney I had never spoken to. Subject line, estate clarification. My stomach tightened. The email was clinical, detached. It informed me that recent developments required a review of existing estate documents connected to the Whitmore family. As a previously excluded heir, my testimony might be relevant. Testimony. I stared at the screen. They were revisiting the will. Not out of remorse, out of fear. I learned the full truth a week later. My grandmother had amended the will 6 months before Thanksgiving, quietly, without telling anyone. She had restored my inheritance split evenly between Rebecca and me and placed conditions on the family business that would have forced transparency measures years ago. My father had contested it. He had convinced her she was confused, influenced, ill. The amendment had been shelved. Now, under investigation, under scrutiny, under the slow collapse of his authority, the truth had surfaced. The lawyer met me in his office, hands folded. You were never meant to know, he said. I know, I replied. The document is valid, he continued, and it changes everything. I walked out into the sunlight feeling something close to vertigo. All those years, all that erasure, and the one person I thought had agreed with it all had tried in her own flawed way to stop it. I didn't tell my parents I knew. I let the legal process unfold. The final confrontation came at Rebecca's wedding. It was small, elegant, carefully curated to look untouched by scandal. I hadn't planned to attend, but Rebecca asked me herself, her voice quiet, almost hopeful. Just come, she said, as my sister. I did. The ceremony was held in a garden outside the city. White chairs, soft music, the kind of setting designed to make everything look forgiven. My parents sat in the front row. My father looked frail, my mother rigid. During the reception, my father approached me near the edge of the lawn. You knew, he said. Yes, I replied. You waited, he accused. Yes, I said again. His mouth tightened. You could have ended this. I did, I said, on my terms. The probate ruling came down the following week. The amended will was upheld. My father lost control of the remaining assets. The trust was restructured. The company was placed under independent oversight permanently. And my inheritance was restored. I didn't celebrate. I donated a portion immediately to housing advocacy funds. I placed the rest into a foundation that would fund exactly the kind of work Clear Ground had started. My parents stopped calling. Rebecca sent a single message. I understand now. I replied with one word. Good. Standing in my office one evening, city lights stretching endlessly beyond the windows, I realized something that surprised me. The inheritance didn't feel like victory. It felt like punctuation, a period at the end of a sentence that had run on far too long. They had tried to control me with money, with silence, with legacy. Instead, they handed me proof. Proof that even when they thought they had erased me, the truth had been waiting. And in the end, the truth didn't just speak. It rewrote everything. The weeks after the ruling were quieter than I expected. No victory laps, no dramatic confrontations. Just a steady unwinding like a knot finally loosening after years of tension. The world didn't pause to admire justice. It kept moving. And for the first time, I moved with it instead of against it. Clear Ground grew faster than I had planned. Not recklessly, intentionally. Cities reached out not because of my last name, but because of what we had built. Training programs took shape. Young planners sat across from me, eyes bright, asking questions I once didn't know how to ask out loud. I saw myself in them. The hunger, the fear of doing the right thing in a system designed to punish it. I told them the truth. This work will cost you something, I said. It might cost you comfort, approval, security. but it will give you something else. What one of them asked. Your spine, I said. And that matters more than you think. The foundation I created quietly funded pilot projects in neighborhoods that had been promised everything and given nothing. Not glossy transformations, just stability, protection, dignity. That word followed me everywhere now. Dignity. One afternoon, as I was reviewing a proposal, Mara knocked lightly on my door. You should see this. She handed me a thin envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper smelled faintly of lavender. It was from my grandmother, Eleanor. I was wrong to be silent when it mattered. I thought peace meant quiet. I see now that it meant courage. I am proud of you. I wish I had said it sooner. I read it twice, then once more. The words didn't erase the past. They didn't soften it. But they did something quieter, more honest. They acknowledged it. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. Rebecca called a few days later. Not to ask for anything, not to explain herself. I'm moving, she said, to another state. Why, I asked. Because staying means pretending, she replied. And I don't think I can do that anymore. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. That takes courage. She hesitated. I learned it from you. We didn't say goodbye like sisters in movies do. No tears, no promises to call every week. Just understanding. The press eventually lost interest. Scandals age quickly when there's nothing left to hide. My father faded from headlines, from influence, from relevance. I heard through third parties that his health continued to decline, that he rarely left the house, that he spent long afternoons staring out windows he once believed he owned. I didn't visit, not out of spite, out of clarity. Some doors close because they must. One evening after a long day, I stayed late in the office. The city hummed outside, lights blinking like distant stars. I stood by the window and thought about the woman I had been a year earlier, sitting at a Thanksgiving table, believing silence was survival. I almost didn't recognize her. Revenge, I had learned, wasn't about watching someone suffer. It was about refusing to suffer quietly anymore. My phone buzzed with a notification, an email from a small town council. They had voted unanimously to adopt our framework. Unanimously. I smiled. Not because I had won, but because something had shifted. Systems don't change because one person speaks up. They change because someone refuses to sit down when told. As I shut down my computer and reached for my coat, I felt something I hadn't expected when this all began. Peace. Not the fragile kind my family worshipped. Not the kind built on denial. The kind built on truth. I turned off the lights and stepped into the night knowing the story wasn't ending yet. But the hardest chapter was behind me, and the last one would belong entirely to me. The last Christmas I spent at my parents' house taught me what it felt like to be erased. This one taught me something else. I spent it alone by choice. Not lonely, not bitter, just intentional. Snow fell steadily outside my apartment window, soft and unhurried, covering the city in a quiet that felt earned. I had turned down every invitation that year, the polite ones, the awkward ones, the ones offered out of curiosity or obligation. Instead, I cooked a simple dinner, lit a single candle, and let the silence settle around me like a blanket. It didn't feel empty. It felt complete. Clearground had closed its first full year with more projects than I had dared to imagine when I sat shaking at my kitchen table months earlier. Cities I had never visited were implementing policies built from frameworks we designed. Young planners I mentored were leading meetings with confidence I recognized as hard-won. The foundation funded housing protections that would outlive any headline, any scandal, any family name. Nothing flashy, everything real. Earlier that week, I had received a small package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single object, a photograph. It was old, slightly faded. Me at maybe 7 years old, sitting on the steps of that same colonial house sketchbook in my lap tongue between my teeth in concentration. I remembered that day clearly. I had been drawing the house as I wished it were brighter, wider, more open. My grandmother had taken the photo. On the back in careful handwriting were 4 words. You were always building. I held the photo for a long time. For years my family had tried to convince me I was the problem. Too sensitive, too rigid, too difficult, too unwilling to accept the way things were. But standing there in the quiet, I finally understood the truth they had never been brave enough to face. I hadn't been difficult. I had been incompatible with their lies. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat at my desk, the city lights blinking steadily beyond the glass. I opened a new document not for work, not for planning, not for strategy. Just for myself. I wrote about the Thanksgiving table, about the will, about being excluded and punished for refusing to bend. I wrote about the slow realization that love with conditions is not love, about the fear of stepping away from everything familiar, about the strange freedom that comes when there is nothing left to prove. I didn't write it for publication. I wrote it so I would never forget. Later, as midnight approached, my phone buzzed with a single message, a number I hadn't saved but recognized immediately. My father. "Merry Christmas, Eleanor." I stared at the screen. For a moment, I considered replying. Something kind, something final, something that might have brought closure in the way stories promise it should. Then I set the phone face down. Closure isn't something other people give you. It's something you claim. I stood by the window as church bells rang faintly in the distance, their sound drifting through the cold air. Somewhere across the city, families gathered. Some in joy, some in tension, some at tables where unspoken words weighed heavier than silverware. I thought of the women who would listen to this story, women who had been told to be smaller, quieter, more grateful. Women who had been cut out of Will's businesses, marriages, conversations, lives. Women who had survived not because they were protected, but because they were resilient. If this story had taught me anything, it was this. You don't need their permission to rebuild your life. You don't need their apology to move forward. And you don't need their inheritance to know your worth. The night deepened, snow continued to fall, and for the first time in my life, the future felt wide instead of heavy. I turned off the light, letting the darkness hold me without fear. The girl they tried to erase no longer needed to be seen by them. She was already visible to herself. And if you're listening to this now, if you've ever sat at a table where you were tolerated but not valued, if you've ever been made to feel like a burden for having a backbone, remember this. Being excluded can be the beginning of your freedom. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not payback. It's becoming impossible to ignore. If this story spoke to you, share it. If you've lived something like it, tell your story in the comments. And if you believe dignity is something no one can take from you unless you hand it over, like, subscribe, and stay with me. Because some stories aren't just told, they're survived.